You're listening to the Flex Success Podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzie, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in the trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media.
We are back. Another podcast with yours truly, and joined today by George. Mate, welcome back on the pod. Mate, we haven't done a duo pod, I think, since I was maybe in Argentina, which would have been in the summertime at the start of this year.
Yeah,
I think. Anyway, I'm sat up here in my my parents' spare bedroom on the Gold Coast. I've taken a high chair from the outside and I've stuck it on top of a chest of drawers that is down here for people who are watching YouTube. Like, I'm set up so randomly for this podcast. The fan's on. I'm like, I hope that doesn't make too much noise. But hey, here we are. And you're in lovely England, but said you're in lovely England, so.
Mate, lovely is definitely not the word for this. We've got very much Melbourne-like weather at the moment, 4 seasons in one day kind of vibes going on. Yeah. I do feel sorry. I've got Blake over from Oz to compete in the Europa qualifier this weekend, and he got here and the first thing he said was, wait, wasn't it summer on your story yesterday? Yeah, this is summer. It looks kind of pretty in pictures, but when you actually feel it, it's not really that great.
Yeah. How's Blake going?
Mate, really, really well. Funnily enough, peak week for him has been basically nothing different. Just eating his high day food, rolling through cruisy, just watching the look just kind of fill back up a touch. Moved literally nothing.
Beautiful. That aside, Queensland Comp is on tomorrow as we're recording this. So this won't come out, I think, for another week or so. So by the time this comes out, the New South Wales Comp may have come on, may have already completed. So keep an eye out for the updates there if you haven't checked them out already, see how our clients are going. And then we'll be rolling into the Nationals, which means then a week after this goes live, it will be potentially rebound, recovery, or reverse phase for our clients. So we thought we'd talk about it because there's plenty of guys coming out of comps, plenty of girls coming out of comps. And we'll talk about the infamous post-show rebound. So
hell yeah. That beautiful time of the comp where some magic and also quite a lot of shit could happen.
That's the scary thing, right? Is that there can be a lot of good achieved in the post-comp phase, a lot of good. But it is also the phase that is most sensitive to people just absolutely obliterating themselves, both physically and mentally. So,
absolutely. To start it though, should we run through some definitions on the different kind of phases post-show could look like, just so the listeners have a gauge?
Yeah, man.
So the most common that I think everyone will typically have to go through at some point in their competitive career is the recovery phase. And I think it's important to understand why most of the time recovery phase is typically the appropriate one. We think about the cost of prep, that elongated state of kind of negative environment for fatigue, that will accumulate a large degree of stress, whether that be physiological, psychological, and that will have to be washed off post-comp before you can actually really get yourself stuck into the hard yards of the off-season. You can't just bounce from one to the other. There will be a lot of potential blood work markers, internal relationships with other people, social connections and things that need to be reset. And that should realistically, health and social mental state should be the priority post-comp for any athlete going on that endeavor.
Yeah, I think most people should be considering this phase a recovery phase. However, so recovery back to, I suppose a health status that we may deem to be sufficient to move into the next phase, like you said, through multiple different domains. The other one that was quite common back in the day, Lane Norton sort of, pushed this one out there was more of what he would classify as a reverse, I guess you could say. So a slow, steady reaccumulation of body weight and or calories and moving back into life very slowly, trying to slowly reverse your way out. I don't think we'll really touch on this one other than to say that the slower you go in this phase, the slower you return to baseline health metrics that we would deem to be sufficient to then go into the next phase. So 9 times out of 10, we're not going to recommend a reverse. The only time it may be suitable is primarily if somebody has a lot of psychological hardship or concern around the regaining of body fat and reintroducing themselves into life again if they've become quite isolated. Of which, if that is the case, and you're a coach listening to this or a client listening to this, I think it's probably critically important that you seek outside help there for somebody who has a far better skill set than ourselves in that psychological domain. So That's the reverse. We won't touch on that one.
That was the only note I had on the reverse, is that, yeah, I can see its efficacy in a person who potentially has issues with weight regain. But then also, if you have a person who's competing who has issues potentially with weight regain, that's most likely a behavior and a habit that needs to be addressed prior to actually competing in the first place, typically most of the time. Maybe I've seen an argument for some smaller categories, bikini, physique, when there is a really awkward show schedule coming up where potentially you know, maybe first time working with a client and you don't have that data and understanding of their maintenance rebound, bringing their calories back up to baseline. Potentially you might spend a little bit of time just dipping your toe in the water with that in a reverse like fashion for a very short window, but it's not really ever a normal thing that I would ever put into a plan now for post show.
Yeah. I think, you know, if by virtue of what we're trying to do is to reestablish health metrics in the recovery phase, or in the post-comp phase, I should say, generally speaking, and we know that those are largely determined by calorie status, energy balance, you know, exercise, sleep, mood, all of these things. The only way that those things are removed, or sorry, returned to baseline, is through the escalation of the things that we've removed. So it's just delaying the inevitable. For people that have found success in it in the past, it's not to say that it isn't possible to do it. It's just probably not best practice, you know. And I think that's probably one thing to be mindful of too, is there's best practice, and then there's something that is still like manageable and tolerable. Like, you can do it. It doesn't necessarily mean you should do it. And then the infamous one, mate, is the rebound. You know, the almighty rebound, you know, going from competition prep straight into an immediate growth phase.
It's I think that the biggest take home from the rebound that I would say for most people to appreciate is that, you know, it looks enticing, it gets very exciting towards the back end. We think, oh, this beautiful like 4 to 6 week window potentially where I can start making, you know, like a whole off season's worth of progress and look change. And just remember, there's a lot of internal physiological settling points that need to occur within fluid maintenance. Fluid balance needs to get back to homeostasis. Your body fat levels do still need to reset back to a baseline of homeostatic maintenance where you feel good physiologically. So it's not just all going to be about mass. And a lot of that kind of mass initially is going to be a lot of things that aren't actually muscle restoring back in your physique. So don't get too excited. But it is probably the most awesome time to put on tissue and also regain body fat.
Yeah, gross tissue. Not as in like,
yes,
ew, it's gross, but just grossly speaking, all over. Net balance, exactly. Net mass.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you and I are actually probably a little bit different here, which is probably like part of the fun of this discussion, is that I would say that I might even hazard a guess and say that I've never deliberately rebounded somebody the moment out of competition. Other than if I know that they're having to re-diet back down, like within probably 2 to 3 months, whereby I'm like, let's try and get the most done that we can in the shortest amount of time, knowing that fat accumulation is limited by time, assuming we don't like jack calories ridiculously. But in almost all times, every other client that has then a long-term goal that's 12 months and beyond, the first phase is always centered around recovery. The major difference probably that I've changed over time is maybe the length of time spent in that recovery phase. And that one is largely individual.
Yeah, see, I'm a little bit more trigger happy, I'd say, in trying to maximize the rebound, definitely. Not that I think this is, again, I'm not trying to put it on a pedestal as if you can, like the common terminology of like, oh, a whole off season's amount of mass in a short time frame. That's not what we're trying to achieve. But I am definitely one for trying to get back on the horse and try and create some structure. And I find that most of the time, especially with some of my younger individuals, having that kind of goal set point in front of them where it's like, yeah, we're still going to integrate some balance, and I don't want people to think I expect people straight back on militantly prep environment in the back end, because that's important not to, but I do like to have some structure back in line and a goal in the near future, because I find it mentally keeps them a bit more switched on, especially my younger athletes that are a little bit more impulsive and a little bit not immature as in they're immature people, but not quite as wise, I would say.
Yeah, I almost certainly shift them into a rebound phase. Because like, if we were to define a rebound as beginning a growth phase in the absence of having returned to baseline body fat prior to the deficit, all of my guys do a rebound, right?
Yeah.
It's not like I'm just like, hey, let's just exclusively gain body fat for the next 10 weeks. and take no drugs and do all this sort of stuff, and then we can just grow after that. That's not what I'm suggesting. But so it's probably like a delayed rebound primarily for me, because I think reestablishing behaviors and sort of like even just learning to still be comfortable with being somewhat more uncomfortable, because the post-comp phase is very difficult to deal with from a hunger management perspective, sets them up very well to then be willing to accept a little bit more discomfort in the initial push-up phase, because the food is still not going to go excessively high. And what I would say is this too: my rebounds have shortened a lot of the time now in their duration after the initial recovery phase than what they used to before. So for example, in the past, I may have said, all right, let's do a recovery phase of somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks. Typically, it was usually 6 to 8, because there was a reestablishment of body weight and body fat and making sure their bloods were good and all this kind of stuff. And that usually took about 4 to 6 weeks. And then I like to see like kind of 2 weeks of consistent behaviors that just see you stable and idle, so that we know idle, so that we could basically know, hey, this is maintenance, right? Cool. We've got a really, really good idea now of like where maintenance is. We can shift into a growth phase. But then those growth phases may have been like 16 to 18 to 24 to 30 weeks, depending on what they could tolerate. Whereas now I quite like a little bit more aggressive initially, and then a taper off of the recovery phase, followed by a rebound phase. And that might only be 4 weeks up to 6 weeks, especially for my pro guys, because I think time sensitivity is a bit different for them. There's usually less time between shows, so you don't have as much time to fuck around. And then the growth phase initially after that is probably only like 12 weeks for most of them.
I'd say we're pretty aligned, except for just the shift. I usually jump into post show a bit quicker in that rebound, but same thing, and a similar approach there is I typically don't have them pushing that window quite far. I usually go post show. The recovery is now not really a recovery, it's more of a maintenance phase to let some initial adaptation settle off, but recovery from a PED perspective, and then I rock it back into the off season from there for a shorter time frame before mini cutting. I'd say that's probably more of I know it is very much person to person, but I think that's an overview generally of practice now, that I do keep my pushes a little bit more condensed in time frame rather than letting them run for too long.
Not specifically on topic, but why?
I find that rates of gain can sometimes start to run away from individuals a little bit too quickly, not just in regard to their resistance, insulin resistance, or other physiological processes that change as they get fatter and start to run away. But I find that the look is much easier to predict when they are a lot leaner. So I find myself trying to keep a bit closer to the goal point now than I used to in younger years, where I'd be like, let's push the off season a bit harder. We can diet down a bit more, still within reason. But now I'm sort of 5 to 10 kilo above stage weight at maximum most of the time with my individuals.
Yeah, I've certainly found that the tolerance to growth, and when I say the tolerance to growth, I mean the things that are required to grow: the drugs, the body weight, the fatigue, the recovery demands, all that sort of stuff. The tolerance really starts to waver beyond about 3 months, unless somebody is just really locked in on the process.
Man, there's only a few clients like that you see him just clockwork constantly. Matt Baker I shout him out every time. Off seasons, he probably mini cutted the least out of any one of my clients, because everything was basically prep just repeated in a surplus. And that worked for someone like him in that stature. But most people aren't really in that mindset, or of that mindset where that is like what lights them on fire. Usually they need a bit more balance around it.
So what are you relying upon to determine whether or not you would put somebody into a rebound versus a recovery phase?
I think the main 3 things to consider, first and foremost, and I think most important, would be health from both a physiological state and a mental state, before you consider all the other factors. Blood work is obviously critical, just to double check that underneath the hood, you're not going to potentially jeopardize this person's short, medium, or long-term health in lieu of keeping the drugs a little bit higher for a little bit longer. It's only another potential 4 to 6 weeks of mass in here. Is it really worth that trade-off to jeopardize some things that could take months to potentially recorrect, of not being able to push? The trade-off probably is a little bit worse there in that situ. I do think people can get a little bit frozen by bloods post-show, in that there is going to be some markers we have to appreciate will be affected, but not in a state that we deem poor or in lieu of like danger to your health in that situation. Some things like compound selection is important at the end there. there. And if there are any methylated orals, we know that there's going to be a couple of things that might get a little bit elevated. And providing you have that kind of check in the post window of, say, 2 weeks before you check the bloods and remove those inputs, most of the time they're going to be back into a more normalized range that gives you the clearance to go. If you check them literally 1 day post, you're probably going to get a big cross on your post show window, because there is things in the short term that are affecting them. So that's obviously a big practical tick to get in. But then mentally, this individual's just spent maybe 20, 30 weeks in a deficit. They've probably felt somewhat restricted in a social parameter to an extent, maybe not massively or massively detrimental, but to a degree, they're going to be somewhat saturated in that respect. And socially, they might need a bit more time to give back to those around them. And by expecting them to jump into a post-show mass, we're essentially keeping things cranked up. We're still in sort of, we're not might not be sixth gear anymore, but we're still in fourth and fifth gear, still floating around those high gears. And thus it usually leads them a little bit tanked if they carry on extending that potential restriction on social parameters, where they might start to feel more withdrawn from their partner, their families, their friends. So if they're not mentally in a good position to extend the prep essentially that little bit further from some restrictions, probably not a good idea to run this person through, because you're going to get a lot of issues with adherence where they want to be doing other things outside of just pushing aggressively from a bodybuilding standpoint.
So it sounds like to me, like outside of some completely negative consequence averse individual to drugs from a health perspective, most of the decision is largely going to be determined by their psychological health and how that situates them with being able to like get back into this, so to speak.
And that is a pretty critical one as well. Your setup from internal health markers could be great. Your physical fatigue, which is kind of the last piece of the puzzle that I'd normally check on. If physical fatigue's in check and your blood work looks great, that mental state, I need that to be on before I validate the other two. Just because the other two are great, I won't try and push this individual further for the sake of it, even if they want to. That's probably the most important one as the prerequisite that allows the rest to happen.
Yeah, because I mean, as much as you wouldn't advise it, acutely you can have fairly average blood work for a short period of time if you ensure that there's a longer period of time later on that it's not so bad. But acutely there can be a lot of damage done psychologically. Yeah, more so, you know, like that takes a very, very, very long-term approach to trying to reestablish that person into a good spot. So do you have any, I mean, obviously with drugs are in play, it's very difficult in a rebound to kind of have like any arbitrary or objective measures for rate of gain or anything like that. Is it more of for you like just a coaching skill thing that you're looking at the physique, assessing the rebound speed? How do you go about determining those parameters?
I've tried using weight gauges and I will always give clients an estimation of where I think things should go, but I have to have the client understand that this is just an estimation, and the in post show, because of the rapid changes we can see in fluid and other vectors, your weight can move quite aggressively when you just go straight into continuing maximal output of training, keeping drugs high, even though you might make a few changes. There's going to be a larger rebound initially of fluid retention and changes there that could throw the scale weight higher than you typically expect in most cases. Like for recovery phases, if the individual started in an appropriate set point, I think I pretty much agree with you on your kind of approaches to recovery. Sort of 50% of that weight lost should be regained across that phase to an extent. But with rebounds, I used to try and give that gauge by about a few weeks in, typically, like maybe 1.5 to 2 weeks in, they'd be around that point. But I find it's too hard to say it specifically for the client exactly where that's going to land now. And I just give them a rough idea. About a week, we should see maybe a percentage of 25% to 50% increase in the first week. From there on out, as it goes based on look.
Yeah, I think that's another reason why I really like like at least a short recovery phase.
It does allow for you to normalize some things, and as a coach, get a better understanding of if the rate of travel is bang on where you want it, as opposed to just slightly too fast or not quite there. It allows you to have some time to set a base to go off of, I guess.
Yeah, and also like it's very rare that there isn't something that just requires a bit of a pullback in the end of a prep. Like, you know, is there a whole bunch of mental fatigue where the person just needs to shut off from being a robot for a period of time? Like, that usually requires a little bit of a pullback. Maybe, you know, just re-engaging into another like more enjoyable phase is suitable. Sure. Like sometimes there's a niggle that we've just been nursing for like the last 3 or 4 weeks just to make sure they don't break. So it's like, oh, now there's an opportunity for us to recover that. And then there's even just, you know, the mental break, like with a partner or friends and family, like, hey, like I've got this period now where there's a little bit less intensity on my requirements for focus outside of calorie control, because that's a necessity, unfortunately. Where then they're kind of like, they're building up that energy to drive again, which I kind of like, you know, because everyone's very motivated in the post-com phase. And then I find that there's usually like that little bit of a lull period. And then, I mean, for a rebound, it would be quite positive to shift straight into that. But then also it's like, you can build up like almost like a little bit of like mental energy towards the next phase, which I quite like. Like it's almost like, you know, you've got a dog on a lead. This is kind of how I feel. I feel like they're on the lead and you're just like letting a little out, and then you start to hold back in the last couple of weeks, and they're like just choking themselves to say, let me grow, you know, and then off they go. Yeah. And then, yeah, it does allow me to at least, I suppose, have some objectivity to the rebound or the rate of regain of body weight and body fat, so that then when we kick things off and dial things up, we can see immediate responses that then become a little bit more objective. But yeah,
yeah. With the push-up approach that I usually typically take, it does land with a bit more work my end, because it means that I want to look at them a little bit more frequently to make sure that by eye their look is manipulated in the way that I like them to. In the approach that I usually take with post-show, I can't just, you know, set the plan and see them check in a week later, or two check-ins a week. It's usually 3 or more in the kind of post-show window. I'm looking at them close to daily to make sure that is moving up in the right direction. So it would be a lot more predictable and less work my end as a coach if I did just run that recovery, because it is usually a lot more predictable. And I think integrating some life at least in the first week has to happen. Like any competitor post show needs to have some kind of, not celebration if you will, but some time to do some things that, you know, average normal people in inverted commas would do. Go and eat food with your missus, with your family. Whatever that looks like can vary. You know, first could be just post show, could be a couple of meals across the week. It depends on the person and what they want and what they enjoy. And if they have like a big family they've got to give time back to, maybe they want a couple across the week. And that's not to say that these things can't be integrated into a post show mass. They definitely can. I've got some people that would run, you know, a couple of off plans per week, sometimes even 3 per week if it's really necessary and they need that from a psychological standpoint.
So could you give me a bit of a, oh, not me, but me and everyone, a bit of like a, I suppose, like a meta overview of where are we typically seeing people in the fight? Like, let's just take peak week out of it because it's a bit of an anomaly. But like in the last few weeks of a prep, where might you typically expect to see people from like a training like volume perspective? We're going to assume that calories are lowest that they've ever been. Let's just assume that's normal. And then drug status, is it kind of like at the highest, or is it somewhere in between? And then from there, what are the things that you're looking to then manipulate come rebound time? If somebody wanted to get an effective, you know, well thought out rebound, like what dials do you turn?
I think for all of them, the biggest thing to understand or appreciate for the listeners is that you are extremely sensitive to not a lot of movement, which means you're going to get a lot of return on your investment. So from a drug standpoint, things are obviously relatively high for me toward the back end of prep. I'm tallying that up with total milligram being at its peak coming into the latter couple of weeks before peak. And that is going to rise through. And ideally, providing that this is a top tolerance, which it should be if you're prepping an individual that they've been to in the past and you know they tolerate well from a health standpoint in the off season, you would run that through just with the removals of some more situational use drugs that are going to be more toxic in the short term. So methylated orals, 19-nors, any of those derivatives that we know come with a bit more cost for the return on investment, get them pulled out and just run the total milligram as consistent as we can across that post-show mass, probably replaced by some DHT derivative to make up the bigger bolus. And if you've done any kind of lower estrogen manipulation by bringing tests down or whatever else, maybe bump that back up to physiological set points of normal for them where they don't get estrogen-like symptoms. So drugs is pretty simple, really. Just keep it as consistent on a total milligram perspective and pull out the toxic things that we know are going to be the problems on bloods.
Cool. And then just to quickly clarify, that total milligrams is largely or is likely going to be whatever their, give or take. There's always an asterisk to this, people that are listening. Roughly their peak milligrams achieved in an off season. You know, in a prep, they're usually going to come up to somewhere around about that. And then for the entirety of the mass coming out of the show, you're probably just going to keep that and stabilize it. There's not going to be an accumulation phase.
No,
Maybe.
I wouldn't be ramping it up. It's very rare that I wouldn't see a need to push drugs up higher in a back end. Otherwise, my periodization in the back end of prep had probably been a bit off. So yeah, But it's, I'll probably say like 85 to 90% of their total milligram in the off season is usually like my prep buffer. We have to appreciate like off season is a different state for recovery as well, a lot more energy availability. You're in a position where if there was stress, it would probably be a little bit more tolerated than when you're low on body fat, low on energy availability, sleep's gone to shit. Like a little bit back off away from that top milligram. But for numbers sake, yeah, top milligram would be the highest you would run and keep that as consistent as possible. Training is often odd at the end of prep. For most people, you're kind of backing off leading in most situations, unless they maybe look better with a bit more of a trained look, if that was a way to quantify it. But for most people, they're starting to taper off fatigue, start to approach it from a bit more of a recovery bias, where they're starting to leverage and change inflammation states. So they're usually not going to be training a great deal compared to their normal setup in the last like 2 to 3 weeks. So coming out the back into post show, they're usually pretty good from like a training fatigue standpoint, providing they're not pretty fucked from stage day, to then continue training again. But because they've had like this kind of exposure window where they've reduced training intensity, maybe back to like 2 or 3 RIR, maybe lower in 50% in some cases, lower volume than they had been doing through prep, they're usually pretty primed to get back to doing some training relatively quick, as long as you get sleep back in check and food sorted. So the thing to think on for people listening for training is, again, that a little goes a long way. You've just spent a long time accumulating stress. Although you might have pulled back for a couple of weeks, don't get too carried away and thinking you can just jump back to top volumes or stuff from maybe even prep or from the off season. I would go straight in at minimum effective volume, typically on the first week, and then I would auto-regulate based on overlapping soreness and fatigue markers noted by the client, session by session, muscle group per muscle group. And that's how I figure out personally the volume that they can tolerate in this kind of next window of push, and then I would pull back or add dependent on how their response was muscle group to muscle group.
Yeah, I use the exact same vectors there, except the one additional one would be in that phase for sure. And I do this pretty consistently across the board, actually, is to not escalate volume for the sake of escalating, but only escalating it in the absence of progression through effort and or load. So like if you can do more by load and or reps, why just add more sets? Like to me that is by default the definition of junk volume. It's added volume in the presence of already established progression, which to me just sounds kind of silly, like.
Yeah, completely. Intensifiers is another thing, like training methods and methodologies you'd apply. I don't find that there's a need for additional metabolic stress or any kind of cell swelling promotion at this time post comp. You're just trying to keep somewhat inflammation low and in a steady state, and straight sets will just provide the bang for buck that you need to not just that, but also keep it trackable as a coach as well. So you can start to really piece the data together and make those manipulations moving forward. If you have loads of rest pause sets and drop sets and things still integrated in the program, trying to pick apart those fluid movements and changes alongside progress is not really going to be ideal.
Yeah, and I think you said something before that I really, really like, which was, well, not, you didn't say this exactly, but the concept is that, you should be trying to get the most out of the least post comp, move a little, get a lot is similar to the words you use. I think there's a disconnect between the bodybuilding world, who all kind of want to, like live and die by the sword, like more is better, or hardcore sort of mentality and all the rest of it. Whereas, and they see doing less as, for some reason, like, I don't know, like a stab on their manlyhood or something. I'm not sure. There's a bit of a prideful dislike for saying I do less. But I'm always somebody who thinks like I should try and I want to do the least amount of stuff for the most amount of return. Because when that return starts to subside, then I can just do a little bit more. Right?
Yeah. Completely. It's about having tools in the toolbox, right? And if you do go the approach you're taking with as minimum as possible to drive maximal outcome, there's always that little bit more to get that little bit more progress left to play. Whereas if you exhaust all your resources, you're not going to go anywhere. You just be spinning.
Yeah. It's that classic, like Mike Israel's stimulus to fatigue ratio discussion of, like, do you get a little bit more stimulus from a little bit more work? Sure. But how much more fatigue do you accumulate at the same time? And should you think about when you can actually afford to accumulate that fatigue to gain that additional stimulus? Was it stimulatory enough is the question, not was it maximally stimulatory? Because if it was maximally stimulatory, it was probably also maximally fatiguing. So it sounds like, in a nutshell, bro, that like the main needle that is moving here is food, no surprise, and then there's a rejig of the pharmacology setup in that it's moving further away from the potentially toxic based compounds, methylated orals, like you said, 19 ors, that inherently come with a little bit more consideration for health consequences, and then just to shift up in the other ones to match milligrams. And then it's ride that shit for as long as you can.
Essentially, yeah, pretty much. I find that on average, most people would probably go sort of 4 to 6 weeks before there's typically a bit of a negative return. I have had individuals where that has all kind of gone out the window, and we have just integrated into an off season. You know,
Yeah.
like if it keeps rolling and the ship's moving fine and there's no issues, bloods are still all good, blood pressure's great, sleep's great, relationships great with everyone else around you and yourself, we're going for it, man. We're going to continue running through, but it just
Yeah.
often isn't.
What sort of things do you find people run into then at that 6 week mark?
I do find that I feel like there's maybe an initial exposure window of the post-show mass where endorphins and kind of like that motivation from prepping is kind of giving you a bit of a push. And then there's almost like this wall that you hit by about 4 to 6 where the fatigue actually starts to be a bit more recognized. It's like all of a sudden all the noise turns off, and you get it at the end of prep where you back people off and you start to try and promote recovery, and they're like, fuck bro, I feel worse than I did 2 weeks ago. So no, you feel the same, you're just aware of it now. I feel like that endorphin drop happens sort of a couple of weeks post. You can ride that for a little bit longer before they do hit the wall. And normally it's not so much the physical fatigue as opposed it is the mental fatigue for most. I find that cuts it off. It's usually, hey bro, look, you can continue pushing on it after a deload and do another block, but like I just don't want to. I just want to just pull a little bit, spend some time going out and doing this. I want to condense my time for sessions down a little bit. Almost like that kind of typical prep duration of fatigue carries through, and it's the end point of that is cutting it off, as opposed to like a physical realm of fatigue dictating it.
Yeah, it's like the mystique of the rebound mystique veil drops.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh shit, I'm still in the same place that I was 4 weeks ago. You know,
it is an exception of prep from a fatigue standpoint. It is just another 4 to 6 weeks where we're expecting you to progress and perform pretty like maximally within the confinements of our setup, but with a little bit more food. But it's not like it's off-season food.
And then do you find that if people get to that 6 week mark, is there generally a requirement to pull food back down if the rate of progress then starts to continue to escalate in the absence? Because I'm assuming drugs come down at this point. So someone's 6 weeks out, right? They hit that wall and you're like, okay, it's time to actually just move now back into what I assume is we might, you know, call a maintenance phase. So drugs come down, training volume maybe stabilizes or potentially comes back down. You know, that might be individually dependent. Food might be the one that I think people might struggle with there if the rate of gain has been too great.
I think the predominant factor here is that it doesn't matter when you do it, but irrelevant post competition, 99% of people are going to have to do a recovery. It just might not quite be recovery by its definition post show. I think the after post comp mass, that post show mass window has to be met with a window where you, like you said, pull back on drugs. You can't just keep blasting drugs at the high nines forever indefinitely. So that in and of itself would be a recovery phase from a drug protocol standpoint, at least. But physiological adaptations of body fat levels, sleep, and other things, they should be back to baseline by the end of the post show mass because calories have been going up. So it's not like a full recovery. It's more maintenance. For me, would be maintenance on training, setting energy requirements to keep them stable, so floating around a maintenance S target of maybe 1 to 2 pound, fluctuate up and down, and whatever it really needs to dictate that as moving forward. So from food, if the individual's rate of gain in that first week of pulling drugs down and addressing the fatigue and pulling back on training back to MEV and maintenance, if that still escalates, then there will need to be a slight taper back, or if they have enough fatigue spare, potentially some slightly higher low fatiguing step count, increase NEAT expenditure a little bit just to kind of keep them more stable. But yeah, if the scale weight, is moving in a direction of a little bit too far forwards, it will need to be tapered back. I tend to try and minimize that as a likelihood though, just because I know that pulling back is probably the biggest thing I will have a rebuttal to from any client.
Man, this is why I love these conversations, because I think if anybody looked at the Rebound on paper or on Instagram, which is where everybody looks for their stuff, again, there's this mystique of a magical amount of muscle tissue that has grown, more calories, drugs are in a good place, and they feel like it goes for a long period of time. Obviously, that rebounding period of the visual look post-comp is undeniably the best ever in regards to a gym photo. It's not the best stage look, but from a gym photo, it's like fucking amazing. And I think people feel like that is just happening indefinitely for a long period of time, or it's happening actually with a lot of food. But what it sounds like to me, like as you explain this further and further and further and further, is it really is like a very probably a similar amount of calories that you'd be giving your guys as to what I would be giving them for the recovery. The major difference is that I may de-escalate drugs a little bit quicker so that I can re-escalate them at the 6-week mark when you stop. For this particular individual, like they're one and the same thing. It's just that, like, I also know that a lot of people like find difficulty in stopping at the 6-week mark, and they sometimes, I think they can just grind and grind and grind. And then my question is, half the time is, if I can delay gratification by 4 to 6 weeks, I can probably get 12 weeks of very good work out of them. Whereas if I give them that for 6 weeks and then I ask them to pull back, at what cost does that come to me and the individual then for the next 4 to 6 weeks? Like, and this is where coaching is so fucking wonderful, because some people are just better at one or the other, you know? Like I have these discussions with clients, like, so in a recovery phase, to give some numbers for people, you mentioned this one before, like 50% of weight regained. I kind of like, you know, around about a 5 to 10% gain above stage weight within the first sort of 4-ish weeks, but it's sort of like steadily coming up to where I want it to see that going. And then I like it to stabilize, depending on if we're going into like a longer recovery phase or we're going straight into then a growing phase. Or to be about 50% of their loss, whichever one's kind of the smallest number. Because like if I've had to pull 25 kilos off someone, I don't really want them to gain 12 and a half in 4 weeks, you know. But if they've gotten down to like 80 kilos, I don't mind 4 kilos on in the first 4 weeks. That's probably pretty good, you know. But there's a discussion that has to happen in that phase, and usually for me it is this: would you rather, and it's not a dodgy Liz, would you rather like get food to the level that I think is necessary to get you back to there ASAP, but you have to have pretty good control on that consumption, because I'm already allocating you more than you need. So you can't have what I give you and some more. But know that in 4 to 6 weeks, if we don't kick off a growth phase for whatever reason, some of your metrics aren't in play, we may have to pull that food back. Would you rather that? Or would you rather like we set it at like probably enough calories, but you have a little bit of room to make some mistakes with your tracking, maybe a free meal here and there, as long as you don't eat like an asshole, and then we'll find the rate of progress over this next 2 to 4 weeks, you know? But it just means you're going to have to show more restraint for this first 4 weeks. So like, there's a trade-off, right? Like more relief now, potentially some restraint later.
Yeah, where do you want people to play? It's all the same kind of things, just changed around on a timeline to slightly different intervals. I think another thing that kind of crosses my mind as well with some competitors is their relationship around food, in that they want to be a little bit more free within themselves and eat a bit more here or there. And I find that in those cases, if an individual, you can't get them to stick to and adhere to the recovery parameters, sometimes it is a little bit better to fight your losses and cut your losses, and move them into a little bit more surplus, give them a little bit more food, and then get them training a bit more closer to maximal so that they can make some progressions. It's like if you sit them on recovery, they're going to gain body fat anyway because they're still eating a little bit more. So sometimes it's like, just give them a nudge in the right direction to keep this extending forward. But that's guided via either past experiences or during the prep. You can kind of figure out toward the back end, like my expectation of what they're going to be like post show based on their behaviors leading in. Like, what are they doing with the traditional storage and, you know, storing your nuts mentality? Are they squirreling away food for post show and shit like this? If that's happening, post show is out the window. It's not happening. They're doing that rebound effect.
Yeah, dude. I've just gone blank on what I was going to say, but it is very much the case that if I've seen an individual's rate of progress continue to happen beyond what I would expect, and there's a discussion around the fact that they're just eating more food, it would be like quite literally moronic of me to go, well, these are the numbers that you should be eating, so you shouldn't be gaining this weight. Just stay on these numbers. Like they're going to eat the food anyway. And 9 times out of 10, it's the fact that you told them that they couldn't have more is that they want more, you know? Whereas, and for individuals like that, is absolutely, you know, again, so long as they can do it in a controlled fashion, usually better to just give them a greater allowance, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that, again, that's kind of the art of coaching, right? Is we set up a certain group of parameters. We think this is the result we're going to get. Instead, we get a different one. And then you don't just dig your heels and go, oh, I guess we're here now. So like, too bad. We just keep on. We just move, you know.
That's all.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, like for people just to quickly think, like the reason why I do quite like the recovery phase is because it's kind of like an easy way for us to also take the behaviors that are already established for prep, which hopefully in our instance, I think they're set up pretty well. Like if you take prep and you actually look at it on paper, and you remove the severe dieting part to the point where you're just so fatigued and some of the social isolation that is necessary to a degree, the behaviors that people like embark on are pretty good. They're active, they train, they take drugs. Let's just put that one to the side for a second. You know, they try and focus on sleep and recovery, and all of the things they do are great. They have control over their food. They understand about like maybe the difference in food palatability and palate fatigue and all these things. If we can just like kind of like let the reins out on those a little bit, then they just continue the same behaviors. Then when we get into the next phase, it's like they just dial up a little bit further into that growth phase too, which I quite like. And yeah, I guess for people that are trying to decide which one they go about is to think about this holistically. Is like, yeah, where am I at mentally? Where am I at physically? Which one requires the greatest amount of attention? And then choose your path of least resistance, probably, and go that route. But understand no action comes without a cost to benefit ratio. And you need to be weary of the fact that you may have to pull back if you go harder first. And I think it is also important to note that there is certainly a physiological requirement in the initial phase of both the rebound and the recovery, whereby the sensitivity to like tissue reestablishment is biased towards fat. It ain't contractile tissue. Like your body is not in a state to do that unless you can drive a vector of anabolism beyond natural means. And that would be by taking more drugs or doing more training. Now you can do more training, so there is that, but probably not advised to just take more drugs.
No, not without a pre understanding of data, at least.
Yeah, I mean, here's an anomaly for somebody who like, but what if, the what if here is like, you've taken an individual who's taken very little drugs most of the time. Let's just say they've even just done TRT. They've pretty much completed their prep on little to no drugs compared to what most of them are. They get to the end of prep, they've actually gained tissue because they were exposed to a new anabolic stimulus. Those people can definitely just go the fuck out and straight up, and they can probably escalate their milligrams a little bit and see tremendous returns on investment. But if you're an advanced guy who's just trying to eke out like 1 kilo every year, you need to think about like, how do I spend the most amount of weeks for the next 52 weeks in an anabolic environment? Not what is the best tomorrow for 4 weeks? Again, like delayed gratification. What happens in 52 weeks? Like, what does that look like? And for me, I'm always like, all right, let's slight delay, build tolerance, build energy, grow. Stop, grow. Like it's the same with training. We said before, junk volume concept shifted across. Like if you can train for 7 weeks and accumulate volume steadily before deloading, as opposed to redlining the fuck out of yourself for 4 weeks and then having to deload every fifth, you're going to train technically in a more anabolic environment for another 2 or 3 weeks a year. To me, that's a net win. So
100% it is. I think the difference on timelines for whether I think it's warranted to do a post-show mass or not does also depend on the experience of the individual. Like how many, like you said, how many big open guys that are massive in body weight are going to be in a real position to actually maximize on new novel adaptation post-show? They're not. They're going to be waiting for that kind of luxury window they have to build momentum to really get that 0.5 to 1 kilo once they've accumulated all the vectors to achieve that first. And that's just not primed ready for them coming out the back of comp. For most of the physique classic guys, some of the young guys, like I've got quite a few that are more early in their competitive careers, there's still quite a lot of runway to clear. So I find for them it's more appropriate. Like your age as a competitor definitely makes the difference on which approach is probably more appropriate for you, just due to mileage on the physique. Yeah, and if in 90% of the time, if you're unsure, recovery is your safe bet.
I would agree with that too.
Yeah.
Anything we've missed?
Sounds like I'm a bit of a post-show rebounder. Like I'm a bit of a pusher compared to you, Dean. Just want to clarify for the listeners. Yeah, I might be a bit more trigger happy with it, but again, I'd still say 90% of my competitors post-show are not rebounding. There's only a few that typically do each season.
Yeah, I mean, I've witnessed that from a distance, right? Or in close proximity, realistically. The large majority of them don't. And I also, the reason why I ask you all these questions is because I know what your rebound looks like, not what it's perceived to be in the bodybuilding industry. Because you do see this, it's what it certainly isn't is like this reaccumulation to a new weight where you think you've gained new tissue. Like if you've gone from stage, if let's just assume that you're otherwise like a fairly well-established competitor and you've dieted off a fairly normal amount of weight, but you've never been like above a certain weight. If you just hit the go on calorie escalation, like tissue accumulation happens at a relatively controlled rate and it's limited. Fat accumulation is less limited. So like, if you think that this tissue that you've gained is magically more, it's probably not. The guys that I see go from comp prep to beyond previous body weight in the version of a puffer fish where their faces are like just edemas, almost always those guys, I don't see them progress much further when they get to the next year, because they just hit a massive fucking roadblock. There's bottlenecks galore. Like, which one do I try and fix first? And then they end up just in a slump for a while and they never get any further. The guys that try and go too slow, similarly, end up nowhere next year. But the ones that have like a good grasp on, like, I can go pretty hard here for a short period of time and then I'm going to break and then I'm going to go again. Or the guys that say, I'm just going to delay that accelerated just a small margin. Usually, like, I mean, dude, there's not many occasions where I haven't had guys 2 or 3 kilos heavier every year. And I just don't think that happens that frequently. Like, I mean, you've got a couple of guys that I know that weighed in today that was certainly nowhere near as big as they were, you know?
It's, I think the post-comp window can really, it's quite important. It is incredibly important, not just from the athlete's kind of internal environment, but also the off season to come. This first window here, depending on how you approach it, how you learn to approach it, really does dictate how a large portion of the rest of the year is going to go. It's an opportunity in whichever approach you take specific to you to build momentum. It should always be a complement for the phase after. Prep should be a complement for the off season after. The off season should finish you in a position where it complements the prep to come. And if that's always the goal with either or approach. It's whichever one's going to make the individual land in the best position that we can then keep that rolling forward. Sometimes massing after gets momentum going again before the off-season kicks off. They don't mind a little pullback to rocket forwards, or like you say, your preferred there would be to do the recovery first, pull back, and then rocket. It's all about setting the off-season up always.
100%.
Rather than mass.
Yeah, like, just don't look like 2 feet in front of you. It is exactly that. Like Georgie said, it's like setting yourself up for the next phase. And to be honest, dude, when I have guys with a ton of resistance to the recovery phase, because like for me, I'm like, all right, let's try and do the least amount of training possible, like for the next 4 weeks, so that we can add some more in later, you know, like 4 sessions a week, maybe 10 sets a session, like as little as possible. But you know what you can do when you eat more food? Get fucking strong. So let's set you up so that you're in like a really good position to be very strong, so that you enter into the next phase at peak strength. So that when we accumulate training volume, you're doing that at peak strength, which means more progression. All right, cool. And then similarly with food, like let's eat enough to get you back to like feeling pretty healthy, but let's give ourselves an opportunity to escalate this further later on. And then the drugs are the same. It's like, you know, I don't need you at peak drugs, but I'm also not going to put you back to baseline, because we don't have time to waste in 4 weeks to reaccumulate over 8 weeks. So for me, it might be like, you know, 70% reduction instead of like, or 60% reduction instead of like a fucking 80 or 90% reduction, just to pick some arbitrary numbers. Like, there's more drugs in play still in the recovery phase than there would be in a TRT phase, but there's not as many as there would be in a peak phase. So we don't have to like delay that part. And I'm always saying to people, this is a preparatory phase for growth. That's, to me, that's my thing. It's a preparatory phase for growth. I know you want to do more, but we're in preparation for growth, you know? So
yeah, completely.
Pick your poison, peoples. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think there's a right and a wrong answer for each individual.
Just don't full send it. It's the only thing.
Yeah. Do not full send it, man. That ain't just shit doesn't work. Unless, of course, you do want blood pressure issues, edema, and all the rest of it, you know.
If you do, whatever floats your boat.
Well, they'll float. They'll be the ones floating, bro. George, be less shit tip.
Don't overestimate what can be done at the back of comp, and appreciate that the window of time frame is a preparation for the next phase and not a magical window to turn into peak off-season mass.
Cool. My be less shit tip would be, don't think of prep behaviors in isolation. Think of the recovery phase as an extension of your prep with just less restriction. I think the more that you can settle in on that, the better off you'll probably do in either phase, because you'll either take a fairly militant approach to eating enough and training very hard, or you'll take a fairly militant approach to then like having some more restraint for the recovery phase. Both of them will serve you well. Something worth sharing. It is not completely relevant to this, but I think it's actually like, and it's a self-plug, to be fair, for Flex. I think it's a really good discussion around food behaviors, understanding what your nutritional needs are, understanding like different things like cravings and appetite control and a whole bunch of stuff. And I think like people, if you're interested in like trying to figure out like maybe some of the shit that makes you tick and how to get a control of food in a less like rigid manner, and you want to have like a bit of flexibility around your nutrition, then our ebook Life After Dieting is really fantastic. It's designed for individuals who have dieted down and now want to live life after dieting. Like, how do we go back to life after dieting? Who would have thought that's what it's about? But I kind of think prep is similar. You know, there's a lot of similarities there. You know, it's a heavy restriction of behaviors and food, and it's a great book. So check that out. It's on the website. It's in all of our quick links. And last but not least, a would you rather. I should put you on the spot, George, to come up with one.
A normal would? Oh, I've got to come up with one.
I said I should put you on the spot to come up with one. No, I've given you a George specific one. I feel like when I wrote it, I was like, this is too easy for him to answer, but maybe not, because then I just try to add a few little extra bits and pieces to it. So, George,
give me some. Let's go.
Would you rather, having never had a psychedelic experience, so you don't know what you're missing out on? That's the important asterisk.
Yep.
Or it be a 50-50 every time you do them as to whether or not it'll be a good or a bad trip.
I mean, that's kind of the prerequisite most of the time, eh?
You don't know if you've never taken them.
You know, oh, see, if I was not with my personal experience, I would probably say the first is probably the better of the two to take. But having my own personal experience here, I don't think there is such thing as a bad trip. I think there is only lessons or fun to be had. So I will always take that latter one.
Fair enough. I asked this because I remember I was at the gym like a couple months ago, and I don't know if I was just tired or just having one of those moments. I'm like, oh man, I feel a bit flat. And then a song came on in my ears, and it was a song that I'd listened to before when I was obviously high, because it just lit my fucking body up, right? And I was like, oh, I'm alive again, right? What is this sensory experience I'm currently? And I thought, oh, and then I like started to think about things. And I was like, oh, that was amazing. And I thought, you know what? I wonder if I wish I'd have never had that experience, because then this experience wouldn't seem like a dull one. Do you know what I mean? So like Liz and I have often argued, like, I'm very emotionally neutral. She may say emotionally stunted. I don't know. She actually says emotionally immature. Whereas like she has like emotions that, you know, rise to a high degree, and then she can have them go down to a high degree. I'm just like flatline, fucking the person's dead, right? And we both agree that we would rather have what we have ourselves than the other person. Like I would rather be neutral, and she would rather have highs and lows, because she says the highs are so great. Yes, the lows suck, but they only make the highs seem greater. And I think of this the same with these, like party drugs, psychedelics, like all this sort of stuff. Like now I just have this like realization that sometimes life is just not that exciting, because that over there is pretty fucking exciting. And I think, like, do I wish that but I'd have to agree, mate.
You open the matrix, and once you open the matrix, it's hard to get back out. I find the perception of life, especially after psychedelics over other recreational drugs, psychedelics definitely open up a different perspective, I find, on a lot of things. I've had a lot of opinions change since embarking down that journey into my viewpoint on life, and I think only for a positive, but in some cases it does provide some level of not mad stress, but it does give you a slight bit of a more negative, pessimistic outlook on some parts of life. I think that once you kind of cross and go down that rabbit hole, you can't look at some areas the same. So I do think it's kind of like taking red pill, blue pill. I find once you kind of crack that open, it probably would have been a lot easier to not, and I'd probably be much happier just cogging the machine, continuing on without having that experience. But also, I'd rather take that little drawback for the big positive.
Yeah, I guess as you'll never know. I think like as somebody who always feared the bad part, like the what if, that was probably what prevented me from doing it for so long. But now having, you know, had experiences that weren't exactly the greatest, and then I've had experiences that were the greatest. I mean, I don't think it's particularly unfair for you to say that they're all just learned opportunities. Because I think even the more bad ones you have, the more you learn to deal with the bad ones, and they become just something more interesting. So anyway.
Yeah. Completely, man.
For anybody who wants to find us, we are available on all of the major hit points. If you enjoyed this podcast, obviously give us a like, give us a share, a 5-star review if you can. Flexsuccess.com.au for the website. Quick links on our Instagram, flex@_success. Hit us up. Coaching, consults, ebooks. We do it all, mate. All the best with your clients this weekend, Georgie, at Queensland, and for the remainder of the shows. And for anybody that does listen to this before the Nationals, if you see me there, come and say hello. Get a photo.